Hello, everybody, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar, Status of Hemlock Woolly Adelgid and Elongate Hemlock Scale in Vermont, and how populations are predicted to change with climate change. My name is Kate Four, and I'm with the Vermont Urban and Community Forestry Program, which is a collaborative between UVM Extension and Vermont Department of Forest, Parks, and Recreation. Today's webinar is our second in a third-part series of forest pest outreach, and is offered in partnership with Agency of Agriculture, Food, and Markets. The webinar series actually wraps up next Tuesday at 12 with a presentation from Dr. Tony D'Amato on ecological, silvicultural, and cultural considerations for ash preservation in a northern forest. So I'll share more about that at the end of the webinar today. Today's webinar is presented by Jim Esden and Savannah Ferreira, who are both with the Department of Forest, Parks, and Recreation. Jim is a protection forester with the department and has been with the department since 2007. Savannah is a forest health specialist. She's been with the Department of Forest, Parks, and Recreation since 2020, and in addition to her forest health outreach work, runs the Forest Biology Lab for the state. Before I hand it over to them, a few quick reminders and logistics for today's presentation. As you probably discovered, your microphones will be muted during the presentation. However, we do want to hear from you throughout the webinar today. Please put your questions in the question box in the side panel. They will be addressed at the end of the webinar. This webinar is being recorded and will be archived for future viewing on our, a link to the recorded webinar will be sent out by GoToWebinar for all those who have signed up. So be on the lookout for that, or please feel free to reach out to me for a link to the recording, which will actually be housed on the Vermont Urban and Community Forestry webinar, YouTube channel. The presentation today is approved for one SAF continuing education credit. To request a certificate of attendance, please complete the survey at the end of the session. Okay, so with all that out of the way, I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to our first presenter today, and that's Jim Esden. So Jim, I'll go ahead and hand it over to you.
Okay. Can you see my screen now?
Yep, your first slide is up.
Okay, good. Well, thank you. And welcome everyone. Good afternoon. My mission today is to tell you a little bit about Hemlock Woolly Adelgid and elongate Hemlock scale, and then turn it over to Savannah, who's going to speak about how climate change may impact these two forest pests. I'm going to start with the Hemlock Woolly Adelgid. It is a pest that came to us from Asia and is now infesting our hemlocks here in Vermont. And I'm having trouble. There we go. There we go. I think probably many of you are familiar with what Hemlock Woolly Adelgid looks like. This is kind of a heavy infestation, but it's characterized by those white fuzzy ovisacs on the bottom or the underside of twigs. HWA is native to Asia, as I've already mentioned, but was noticed in the Pacific Northwest back in the 20s and originally thought to be another invasive. But subsequently, through DNA analysis, was shown to be endemic to that region. And it doesn't really cause a lot of problems there. The native trees are resistant, and there are some native predators as well. Our troubles began in the 50s when Hemlock Woolly Adelgid was discovered in Virginia, believed, as you see, to have arrived on infested nursery stock. And it's been spreading ever since. It was discovered here in Vermont in 2007. And you can see the brown regions on this map are infested with Hemlock Woolly Adelgid, and so are the yellow, I guess. And then the green indicates the range of both the Carolina and eastern hemlock. Most scientists think that it's likely that Hemlock Woolly Adelgid will eventually overspread the entire range of hemlock trees. And Savannah will probably touch on that more later. Here in Vermont, the current distribution is primarily down in Windham County and primarily along river drainages. There are some small infestations in southern Windsor County, right along the Connecticut River. And then there's one outlier way over here in Bennington County in the town of Pownell. So far, we haven't reported tree mortality in Vermont yet, but honestly, I think we're on the verge of that. As you can see in these pictures, there are some trees that are under tremendous stress. Some of them are off-site. Some of them are also infested with elongate hemlock scale. And so I think we may be approaching a tipping point for hemlock. Hemlock woolly adelgid has a sort of complex life cycle. I'm not going to get into the real nitty gritty, but I just want to mention a couple of interesting facts. First of all, you notice that there are two generations. We're currently up here in the winter generation, also known as Sistens generation. Come the end of March or so, we'll get into what's known as the spring or Progredian generation. Both of these generations start from eggs, and the first nymphal stage that hatches from the eggs, they're known as crawlers, right here. This is the only time that this insect is mobile. Crawlers use their stubby little legs to find a new feeding spot and then to attach to the twig, which is known as settling. And once they have settled, they begin to feed, and they never move from there. They feed and live and die in that spot. All the adults are wingless, and they're all female. HWA uses parthenogenic reproduction, meaning that males aren't needed to fertilize the eggs. There is one little brief exception that I'm going to point out to you in just one second. Another interesting thing is that the winter generation estivates during the summer. You can see here that through the end of July, August, September, and for Vermont, right up till the second week of October, HWA is estivating, which is an adaptation to heat, sort of the opposite of hibernating to adapt to cold. But through that period in the summer, the insects are inactive and don't feed. Once we get by the middle of October, they get active again, and then they will feed. And as they feed, they begin to mature and go through 3 more nymphal stages before in late winter, early spring, they will become adults. And then they start laying eggs. Around here, they start laying eggs towards the end of March. And then, of course, the eggs, crawler, nymphs, and adult, that cycle just repeats in the Progredian generation. It's really interesting that they do not feed. They're not active through the summer in the heat. They just don't do well in the heat. And then it's interesting that they're active all through the winter, which is not very common for most insects. But as it turns out, this puts them in perfect synchronicity with their food source. Hemlock woolly adelgid feeds only on hemlocks in the United States, well, at least on the East Coast of the United States. And as it turns out, that's when hemlocks produce the majority of their photosynthate. Ponder that for a minute. It turns out, it's such a shade-tolerant species that they're often found underneath hardwood trees, and they don't get a lot of sunshine until the leaves fall off, which around here in my part of Vermont is kind of middle of October. So once the leaves fall off and more sun comes onto the hemlock tree, photosynthesis kind of steps it up and gets in gear. And that's when the cystine generation starts feeding and growing. Another interesting fact is that they're all females. They don't need males to reproduce, but there is a kind of a, from standpoint of population, a bit of a problem there because it doesn't allow for mixing and diversifying the gene pool. But Hemlock woolly delgid kind of gets around that because the spring generation, in some circumstances, some of their nymphs will differentiate into male and female and grow wings, and then they'll leave hemlock trees for an alternate host. In Asia, that alternate host is the tiger spruce, which we don't have here on the East Coast. And so here on the East Coast, this becomes sort of a dead end from a reproductive standpoint. The adelgids that leave the Procrudian generation to go to spruces are known as the sexuperae, and the sexuperae don't find spruces here on the East Coast that will support them to maturity. So they don't reproduce. There's no mixing of the genetic materials. And so here on the East Coast, the only two generations that are working are the cystine and the Procrudian. And for them, that might be a bit of an Achilles, Achilles heel. So anyways, pretty interesting life cycle. Here's a picture just so you're a little familiar. In the middle, that darker body is the adult, and here these little orange kind of football-shaped glow translucent little bodies. These are eggs, and this white is the wool. It's known as flocculence. Here we see some crawlers. They've just hatched from the eggs, and you can see their little legs. So they're going to crawl out and settle on new areas of the twig and start feeding. And here's a picture on your left. You'll see a magnified view of a nymph. I'm not quite certain which nymphal stage this is, but I think it's probably the third or fourth instar stage. It's greatly magnified, and all the flocculence, or that white fuzzy stuff, has been removed. We do that just with an eyedropper and putting a little alcohol on there, and it takes off the flocculence. But what I want to point out is right here where the pointer is. This is the mouthpiece of the adelgid. It's known as a stylet. It's a long, narrow, syringe-like tube, and you can see right here where it's entering the base of the or entering the twig at the base of the needle. And this stylet goes all the way up here and then underneath the bottom of the insect and then connects up here. This is the head. So the mouth starts up at the head, goes all the way through here, and is actually 3 or 4 times the length of the insect's body. But it's the feeding of these nymphal stages that do the damage to the tree. And the damage, there's 2 modes of damage. First of all, as they feed, through the stylet, they are sucking out starch from the parenchyma cells in the twigs. And of course, the starch is the energy source for the tree. So the tree begins to lose its ability to take on all those metabolic functions that are needed for life. And then secondly, and this is significant, and this is something that's different when we compare the eastern hemlocks with the hemlocks out in the Pacific Northwest. Our eastern hemlocks seem to kind of overreact when they are pierced by the stylet. When that sucking and piercing mouthpiece is pushed through the bark, the insect releases some saliva to aid in that process. And it seems that the tree responds to that saliva by creating what I call scar tissue. I'm sure that's not technically correct, but it forms a good image in my head. And that scar tissue ends up, the tree ends up creating more than is needed. And the end result is that the tree ends up clogging its own vascular system with all this scarring. And that leads to the symptoms that you can see here. Initially, the needles begin to discolor. After a while, they will fall off. Then we get twig dieback, and eventually that can lead to tree mortality. And we can see all of those symptoms here on this picture. There are chemical controls, and they range from horticultural oils and soaps right up through to some of the neonicotinoids, which are very effective at killing Adelgid. Most of the insecticides are applied in various application techniques, but as a systemic. There are some products available that are made from extracts of the neem tree, which are not considered quite as dangerous to the environment as some of the neonicotinoids are. Currently, the Vermont Forest Parks and Recreation doesn't use chemical controls on hemlocks on state lands. But we are involved with biocontrols. There are several insects used. I included this slide. It does not come from this area. It comes from a project down in, I believe, North or South Carolina. But two of the three insects represented here are kind of things that might be considered in New England. Way over at the far right, the Scymnus sinuanodulus, if I said that right, is, I don't believe, even down south, I don't believe it's being used very much anymore. The Sassachymnus tsukuge is used as far north as Connecticut. There is some question as to whether or not it survives the winters. We considered using Sassachymnus here in Vermont years ago, and because we weren't sure if it would survive the winters, we've so far stayed away from it. But in areas like Connecticut and New Jersey, it does seem to have a pretty good effect of reducing hemlock woolly adelgid populations. What we are using, and we have 4 release sites in Vermont, we are using Leukotoraxus nigrinus. It's a predatory beetle. Here I am doing a release. I believe that's in Brattleboro. The beetles come to us packed in Excelsior like this, and it may be hard to see on your screen, but up here there's a whole bunch of little black dots, and those are Leukotoraxus beetles. Here I tried to make a close-up shot, and they don't show up real well, but here's one in silhouette that's actually feeding on an ovisac. There is a lot of excitement about silver flies. They may be a new predator. They're still in the research stage. You can see from this slide that some of the work has actually been done here in Vermont. Their genus name Leucopus has just recently been changed to leukotoraxus, but this is a predator that will attack both the winter and the spring generation, whereas Leukotoraxus nigrinus only preys upon the winter generation. And what will happen is that Leukotoraxus will knock down the winter generation, but then the spring generation, because they don't need to be fertilized by the males, they just rebound in population really, really quickly. So if we have a broader palette of biocontrols that can affect both generations, we feel like we'll begin to get even better biocontrol. So that brings me now to elongate hemlock scale, which is a slightly newer threat. It is native to Japan and was first noticed here in the United States back in 1908 in Queens, New York. EHS is known as one of the armored scales. In other words, it is a scale insect that has a real soft body, but it protects itself by secreting a waxy shield for protection. And EHS does this on the underside of the needles and just gives the needles a real crusty sort of a look. EHS is found throughout the East. In my experience, you can see on this map, there's some up here in the Lake Champlain or the Champlain Valley area, and then down here in Windham County again. And that's my experience so far. Most of the EHS that I see is down in southeastern Vermont. Often I find it in conjunction with Hemlock woolly delgid, in particular on trees that are off-site. There was an isolated infestation in Charlotte back in 2019. That has been treated chemically and considered eradicated. In 2020, another small infestation was found in Shelburne, and it will be treated. The homeowners have agreed to treat them. So here you can see a close-up. This slide shows both male, females. The females have no legs or wings. They are completely sedentary. Their protective shells are elongate. They have parallel sides and are usually white in color. Excuse me. You'd think I'd never done this before. This is the female. They're elongate, parallel sides. They're about 2 millimeters long and generally a kind of a yellowish to brown color. And then this was a male. They're a little bit smaller. Again, parallel sides, elongate shape, and white in color. And as they mature, they begin to create this white waxy fuzz also, which sometimes people would mistake for Hemlock woolly delgid, but these are located on the underside of the needles, whereas Hemlock woolly delgid is found only on the twigs. So the males go through a couple of stages of maturation, and when they do mature, they have wings and legs. They're very feeble flyers, but they are able to fly. They seek out the females who have a couple of extra maturation steps, but when they mature, there's sexual reproduction. The males will find and mate with the females, and then the males die. So again, there's male and female. And then the first instar stage are crawlers. And again, it's got very little nubby legs. It's not very mobile, but it will seek a new feeding spot and attach to the needle and begin to feed on the fluids that are inside the needle. Most EHS overwinter as eggs. Sometimes fertilized females will hunker down and overwinter, but in any case, the eggs are laid and hatched throughout spring and summer. They spread by wind and by birds. The nymphal stages are the ones that create the damage by their feeding. Again, they have piercing, sucking mouth parts, and they withdraw nutrients and fluid from the needles. And the damage starts out, you can see the yellowing that's starting to show on these needles. That'd be the first symptoms. You're probably noticing that this is not hemlock. Hemlock is not the exclusive, in fact, perhaps not even the best or preferred food for EHS. They also feed on spruce, fir, cedar, pine, Doug fir, and yew. But as feeding progresses, this yellowing will increase, and eventually needle drop and dieback can occur, and occasionally tree mortality will follow. The Vermont Forest Parks and Recreation Department does not have a control program for EHS. There certainly are some chemical options. Many of them are systemics. And one of those, it turns out, is also very effective for Hemlock woolly adelgid. There are some natural parasitoids and predators like lacewings and lady beetles that do give some level of population control. We have just, when I say we, I mean the Department of Forest, Parks, and Recreation has just started a monitoring program for elongate hemlock scale. That's why I didn't really have a local map of its range, but we would love it if you're out in the woods and you see hemlock, elongate hemlock scale, or if you just see something crusty on the bottom of the needles that you think might be EHS, I'd love it if you report that. You can do that by sending me a message. My contact information will follow in just a couple of slides here. Or you can do it through vtinvasives.org. Our department does have some information available to landowners and forest managers. You can find them in our website. And here is my contact information. Thank you for the opportunity to share with you. And that's it for my part of the presentation.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Jim, for the really wonderful overview and update on these insect pests. Okay, so now we're going to shift gears a little bit and hear from Savannah, who's going to present to us some information about the predicted effects of climate change.
Hello, can you hear me and see my title slide okay?
We sure can. Everything looks great, Savannah. I'll go ahead and turn it over to you.
Great, thank you. So let's just jump right in. Today I'm going to be talking about the potential effects of climate change on Hemlock woolly adelgid. So first I want to quickly go over the importance of hemlock and why we care about its future in Vermont. First, this is a native tree. It's actually one of the most prevalent species that we have in our state. It has a lot of ecological values. A few examples are that it provides forage and habitat for ruffed grouse, squirrels, porcupine, deer, and bear. It's a breeding habitat for warbler and thrushes, and it has this really nice deep shade that actually helps to thermoregulate streams for brook trout and salamanders. It also has ecosystem services, which include water filtration, carbon sequestration, and oxygen production. Hemlock does have economic value, of course, depending on the markets. It can be used for mulch, plywood, pulpwood, and dimension lumber. So now that you know why hemlocks are important, let's talk about why trees, and in particular, why hemlocks can decline. So trees don't just typically up and die one day. There's usually a variety of factors that can contribute to a tree's death. This is a picture of Mannen's disease decline spiral and is a really great tool to show how abiotic and biotic factors can compound each other. An abiotic is going to be any living thing, non-living thing, and biotic is going to be any living organism. So the first thing we have here is predisposing factors. This is usually abiotic stressors that stress out the tree and reduces the ability of the tree to withstand injury or biotic attack. Predisposing factors can include, but are certainly not limited to what you see here on the screen, including genetic potential, poor soils, climate change, and air pollution. In Vermont, our hemlocks have shallow root systems, and they have low moisture holding capacity and are also facing climate change. Both of these things are stressing out the tree. The next spiral in this picture represents inciting factors, which is either an abiotic or biotic event that causes the first symptoms of decline. This is going to include things like defoliating insects, excavation, drought, frost damage. In Vermont, we've had recent droughts. We've had outbreaks of hemlock looper, hemlock woolly delgid feeding, hemlock elongate scale feeding, and these factors have the potential to greatly reduce the tree's health and vigor and make it susceptible to other pests and pathogens. Contributing factors is the last spiral and represents further damage to an already stressed and low vigor tree. So opportunistic insects and fungi are going to more easily establish and thrive in a weakened or stressed out host. An example of this in Vermont would be our native hemlock borers. Now, it is possible that trees can die from either inciting or predisposing factors. This is just a tool, and it just shows how things can compound if a tree can't survive those other stressors. So for example, as climate change increases, the stress it causes to the tree is also going to increase. We may face more droughts, and therefore trees could die well before dealing with contributing factors. So let's talk about climate change as a predisposing factor. With climate change, we're predicted to see increased temperature, increased rainfall, and an increase in extreme weather events across the country. Increased temperatures will allow for higher rates of evaporation and evapotranspiration and cause an increased need for water. This is going to reduce soil moisture and stress out your trees. Rainfall is expected to also increase. However, this pattern is going to be a lot more sporadic than historic. So although we might see a higher yearly rainfall, this rain is going to come in large quantities in a short amount of time, and it's possible that we'll have extended periods of drought between these large amounts of rain. So drought events are a contributing factor and can lead to tree decline. We're also likely to see an increase in extreme weather events, which include flooding, fire, high wind events. All of these can damage and stress out trees, decreasing their overall health and vigor and making them a more suitable habitat for other insects and diseases to become established. So if you look at this picture here, this is a migrating state climate example showing what Vermont's temperature and humidity might feel like over the next century. The red arrows is a high emission prediction and the orange is a low emission prediction. If we have low emission progression, our summers will feel like summers in Ohio and West Virginia. However, if we have high emissions, it's going to feel a lot more like Tennessee and Alabama. So if we switch the gears back to hemlock woolly delgid, here's the current distribution of hemlock and hemlock woolly delgid in the eastern United States. If we compare that distribution with the state migration map I just showed, you can see that over the next century, our Vermont climate is going to be more similar to the climates where hemlock woolly delgid has been infested for longer periods of time. And we're going to dive deeper into this in the next couple slides. So what may be becoming apparent is that winter temperatures are currently limiting the spread of hemlock woolly delgid in New England and in Vermont. The exact temperatures are still being researched and are predicted to change with climate change. But one study has shown that temperatures up to 23 degrees Fahrenheit could significantly limit the spread of Hemlock woolly adelgid. And although this temperature would reduce population spread, much colder temperatures are still needed to kill off those cold-tolerant adelgids and actually eradicate them. So this study in particular showed that temperatures between -4 and -13 degrees Fahrenheit would significantly decrease the number of intact cells within the HWA, again, meaning that many of them are going to die, but a reproducing population will still remain viable. And if you wanted eradication, you're going to have to get down to temperatures between -22 degrees Fahrenheit and -33 degrees Fahrenheit. And this has to be for an extended period of time. The minimum they showed in this study was 2 hours, but most of them were able to die. So this means that new infestations and populations are likely to be found following years with mild winters. So in Vermont, we do a winter mortality population survey every year to see how many Hemlock woolly adelgids have died. According to our historic data, we need about 90% winter mortality to prevent range expansion. So this graph shows the average percent mortality of Hemlock woolly adelgid, represented in the black thick bars, and the average winter temperatures represented in the blue dashed lines. As you can see, the last 3 years, winter mortality has been well below this threshold of 90%. Last year, it was only 51%. Due to this, we are expecting range expansion. However, we have not yet found Hemlock woolly adelgid outside of already infested counties, just in new towns such as Wethersfield in 2020, but that's inside of the infested Windsor County. So one theory that could explain our low winter mortality are periods of warming temperatures followed by successive days of deep freezes. So having this big temperature fluctuation could have contributed to winter mortality by killing otherwise surviving Hemlock woolly adelgid before they're actually able to reproduce and spread. So what might the range of Hemlock woolly adelgid look like moving forward? Well, here are 2 predictive models of Hemlock woolly adelgid's range over the next century. All of these colored lines here represent isotherms, which are connected points that have the same average temperature at a given time. The blue line is based off historic climate data and is, in this study, the current limiting temperature of Hemlock woolly adelgid, which is 23 degrees Fahrenheit. The green, yellow, and red lines are the predicted data that show where 23 degrees Fahrenheit will be in the future. In these maps, the higher emissions has winter temperatures warming 39 to 43 degrees Fahrenheit, and the lower emission temperatures warming 36 to 39 degrees Fahrenheit. So if you compare the blue line to the yellow line in both of these scenarios, you can see that the threshold temperature for Hemlock woolly adelgid is shifting from lower New England to about halfway up, encompassing most of Vermont, New Hampshire, and the southern half of Maine. By the end of the century, which is now the red line, under the high emission scenario, almost all of the Northeast is going to experience average winter temperatures above 23 degrees Fahrenheit, which would mean that the entire region is going to be susceptible to widespread Hemlock woolly adelgid infestation. Under the lower emission scenario, there are isolated sections of upper New York State, Vermont, and New Hampshire, as well as the northern half of Maine, that is going to remain below this 23 degrees threshold, and therefore potentially be protected from this widespread infestation in this model. However, regardless of the emissions, this range is still moving northward. So what about hemlock trees in the absence of Hemlock woolly adelgid? So this is a habitat suitability model from the US Forest Service Climate Change Atlas that shows the current forest inventory and analysis of eastern hemlock under current climate conditions. Here's that same model from the Climate Change Atlas and shows the likelihood of hemlock's range under moderate emissions. So the pink represents where hemlock already is and is likely to remain occupied in the face of climate change. If we look at Vermont specifically, we'll see some habitat that is listed as medium suitability for hemlock, and colonization of hemlock into that habitat is likely high. We also see some low quality habitat in western parts of the state, also with a high likelihood of colonization. Now, this map was built with a few factors in mind. The first is a positive adaptability traits that hemlocks have is being shade tolerant. This will allow them to regenerate in the understory successfully for an extended period of time. However, they also have negative adaptability traits. They're susceptible to drought, and their susceptibility to insect stressors such as Hemlock woolly delgid. So why did I show you this map? This is a lot of information. Well, with changing climates, we're likely to see hemlock trees growing in less than ideal habitats. This means that them existing in an environment that is not particularly favorable to their growth is going to predispose them to increased stress and lower overall vigor. This means they're going to have a higher likelihood of being susceptible to insects and diseases such as Hemlock woolly delgid. So in summary, climate change is likely to expand the current range of Hemlock woolly delgid and put trees under higher stress, which is an increase in both predisposing and inciting factors. However, I do want to end on an uplifting note because this is a lot of information and sometimes it can feel really gloomy. So let's talk about some good news. The first is that there's increased pressure on federal and university researchers to develop and test silvicultural methods to decrease Hemlock woolly delgid infestations. As Jim mentioned earlier in his talk, there's also promising biocontrol efforts being conducted throughout the range of Hemlock woolly delgid, including here in Vermont. Although this is not likely to eradicate populations of Hemlock woolly delgid, it could get populations down to levels that prevent spread and therefore widespread mortality. There's also new research on Adelgid resistance breeding at the National Arboretum, where Eastern hemlock is being crossbred with resistant varieties of hemlock that are native to Asia. And lastly, Forest Parks and Recreation, which is where Jim and I are working from, has started monitoring summer mortality of Hemlock woolly delgid for the first time this year. There is some evidence that warming temperatures may actually help kill Hemlock woolly delgid during the growing season, especially when there's those really hot days all of a sudden, you get that really wide swing in temperature. So because this is year one, I don't have meaningful data to share with you at this time, but it may be a reason why we're seeing limited spread with such low winter mortality. So here's my contact information if you wanted to reach out. If you think you've seen Hemlock woolly delgid in Vermont, like Jim said earlier, please report it. In Vermont, we use vtinvasives.org, but if you're listening from outside of the state, you use whatever reporting site or contact your state provides. And I think with that, Jim and I can both take questions.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Savannah, for sharing all this great information. And so just a reminder to folks, please go ahead and type in your questions to the question side panel box. It's one of the gray tabs on the side panel. We do have a question already in the hopper. So a question from Elizabeth, and probably starting with this more aligned with Jim. How big is the adult Hemlock woolly delgid?
An adult might be about 1 millimeter long. Kate, can you hear me?
I did. Yep, we got that. So about 1 millimeter long.
Good.
Excellent. Okay. All right. So let's see here. We'll give folks another minute to type their questions in, and a couple of just acknowledgements and thank yous that have already come in from folks thanking both Jim and Savannah for their excellent presentation today. While folks are thinking of questions, I'll just take a minute to promote our next webinar. As I mentioned in the introduction, this is the second part of a three-part series. And so next week we'll be hearing from Dr. Tony D'Amato around considerations for ash preservation. If you're interested in that webinar, you can find the listing on the vtcommunityforestry.org calendar of events. So feel free to check that out and consider joining us next week. Okay, we have a few more questions coming in. Is BT still used to control Hemlock woolly delgid? Donna is wondering. I'm not sure who that's best directed towards, so either one of you are welcome to jump in.
Was that BT? Is that what you said? Like Bacillus thuringiensis?
I'm assuming that's what they're referring to.
I'm not aware of BT being used for Hemlock woolly delgid at all. I'm sorry, but I'm used to it being used more for lepidopteran species.
Okay, thanks, Jim. Let's hear a few more questions that have come in. How do you rank the Adelgid in the list of insect threats to Vermont's forests, or at least how do you rank it in terms of the other insect threats that our forests face?
Oh, well, that's laden with judgment and and bias. I always used to joke around that Hemlock woolly Adelgid didn't get any respect, and all the other bugs that you hear about are federally regulated, and HWA was not. And so I often called it the Rodney Dangerfield of insects. But honestly, I think that the impact that it's having on our hemlocks, at least so far in the southern part of the state, is increasing. And I think as that stress and damage becomes more apparent to the public, that there might be an increase in the interest and activities around HWA.
Great, thanks for that, Jim. And I appreciate the political nature of that question. So let's see here. A few more questions have come in. One from Ethan: what are the silvicultural strategies people are using for HWA and EHS?
Savannah, do you want to take a stab at that one?
Yeah. So a lot of them are still being researched, so I don't really have any hard and fast management tools to share with you at this time. One study is suggesting that managing at low densities, maybe instead of having such a stratified cohort of trees, trying to have an early generation, an older cohort, so you're not providing a ladder for insects to climb. Kind of goes against some of our silvicultural learnings as foresters, but this is still early in the research phase. Maybe Jim has a...
Yeah, because of COVID for the last couple of years, HWA program managers have not been able to get together in person. But 3 years ago, I was able to go to an annual meeting of HWA program managers, and we went on a tour of some spots down in the Middle Atlantic states that are being treated silviculturally. They're part of the research that Savannah mentioned, and they had several different, treatment levels and controls. The data was all preliminary, but the thought is that it's possible that if we allow a little more light to get into the foliage of hemlock, that it helps the tree to grow a little better, and more vigorous trees can withstand the damage of the HWA feeding a little better. But then also it appears that exposure to sunlight may have a negative impact on HWA development and population growth. So the thought was, if we could put a little sun on the tips of the branches, it might help the tree and not help the Adelgid. So it's still being studied, but we do know that they're very shallow rooted. So whatever you do silviculturally, you want to try to take steps to protect the roots. Things like doing your operations on snow or at least frozen ground might help. Doing operations where you leave groups of trees, or maybe do your extractions in rows or something, so that you concentrate your machine time on just certain spots, and then keep certain spots from being compacted. That might be helpful. So those are some of the things that we've recommended just in a general way. The specifics are still, waiting for research to finish, but that's it.
Awesome. Thank you, Jim. And circling back to what you were just sharing about HWA, and there is a question from Richard that asks, how damaging is HWA to the understory sized hemlock trees compared to mature hemlock trees in the canopy or overstory?
Yeah, in my experience, I've found that there often isn't very much difference. You know, the insect doesn't seem to be predisposed to attack one part of the tree or another, but it does seem that understory trees are already, just by nature of their position, under some stress. And so the attack from Hemlock woolly adelgid kind of, you know, adds to that inward spiral like Savannah was showing us. Um, and also I have seen, and it was, I wanted to take the time to point it out, but I knew I was going over in my very undisciplined presentation. I apologize for that, but there was a picture of a tree that represented all the various stages of the symptoms. And the very top of that tree was actually pretty dark green. You know, it had proper color and it was pretty dense. The foliage hadn't experienced twig dieback. And that's a pattern that I see in the woods pretty frequently. And it seems that the portion of a tree that's up exposed to the air and the wind and the sun seems to withstand the impacts of adelgid feeding a little bit better than the portions of the tree that are, you know, down in the forest canopy. They're protected from the weather down there, and the insects seem to survive better. But insects at the very tippy tops of the trees are more exposed and don't survive quite as well. So those are a couple of thoughts in regards to that question.
Great. Thank you very much, Jim. Let's hear a bunch more questions. Hopefully we can get to most of them. A question regarding, are you seeing any change to ecosystems where hemlocks are declining?
Savannah, I seem like I'm talking too much. Do you have thoughts on that?
I mean, you're definitely the Hemlock woolly adelgid expert. As we're seeing hemlock mortality is when we're going to start seeing more ecosystem disturbances. And we are working together to get a group formed to try to understand and quantify these impacts moving forward.
Yeah, and I can tell you that, again, well, I don't have empirical data, but there's no doubt my experience has shown that as hemlock fades away, the species composition changes. We get lots of black birch coming in, and lots of the invasive plants, you know, the barberry, the buckthorn, that kind of stuff seems to take the place that's opened up when hemlock trees start fading.
Great. Well, that's certainly a concern. And just following up on that, a question from Alicia. Your mortality studies make note of both hemlock woolly adelgid and elongate hemlock scale, and if so, is there any indication that it's that there's a higher chance of mortality when both are present? Curious for your thoughts on that.
Yeah, our studies were looking really, we're really only paying attention to hemlock woolly adelgid. But again, I don't have empirical data, but you know, if there's a tree that has coexisting pests, just one would expect that there's a greater impact on the tree. And certainly the trees that I see that worry me the most about dying are infested with both. So again, I'm sorry, I don't have empirical data because we're only beginning to really watch and work with EHS. But yeah, I think that trees infested with both are probably at greater risk.
Great, and maybe Savannah, a question for you. Are there other tree species from further south that can serve similar ecological functions as eastern hemlock, and whose northward migration we might be able to help facilitate?
So unfortunately, because Hemlock's range extends pretty deep into the south, there's not something that can thermoregulate the streams as well. Of course, everything's going to evolve as we move forward with climate change, but off the top of my head, not really, because the eastern United States is mostly Hemlock range.
And that just emphasizes the critical need for work with restoration kind of studies, and also work with resistant trees. There are some hemlocks from New Jersey that have seemed to survive and exhibit natural resistance to HWA, and they are being studied. They are being planted and reproduced and planted in places in an effort to restore areas that were highly impacted by HWA. So there might be some glimmers of hope there in terms of looking for resistant trees.
Yeah, and it is really important that all states work together to do this, and it's why we're so excited to be able to be moving forward with some hemlock work in Vermont, because there's been some studies that show, like these hemlocks in New Jersey, for example, if we were to take their seed source and directly plant them here, or get nursery stock, because they haven't adapted with our very cold winters, that they're less likely to become established. So there is some more work and genetic breeding involved.
That's interesting. And there was a question in the chat box, or excuse me, the question box from Elizabeth around indication of genetic resistance. I'm curious for either of your thoughts in regards to both these pests. Has there been any indication of genetic resistance to these pests?
I have very limited research that I've been able to find in the United States. However, where it's from in Asia, there is some genetically resistant Adelgid feeding trees that they're trying to currently crossbreed with our native varieties. But because this is an invasive pest, there's a lot less natural resistance because it didn't co-evolve.
Yeah, I don't have much more substantive stuff to add to that, but I do know that there is that bomb-proof stand I mentioned down in New Jersey.
Great. And one quick question. I know we've talked a lot about hemlock, and we do have a question from Stephen about what sites might be best for finding hemlock. And I'd be curious, do you know, in terms of helping landowners and folks identify hemlock on their site, what are some of the best tools that you guys use to identify hemlock?
I'm not quite sure I understand. To identify whether it's a hemlock or a pine, do you mean, or to find where hemlock might be growing?
I guess both, Jim. I think the question is, what sites would you find hemlock on? And, just briefly, clearly, there's a lot to this question. But I'm also curious, if there's one characteristic or one trait that helps you guys when you're out in the field, just confirm that it is in fact a hemlock and not a balsam fir or pine or other coniferous species.
Yeah. Well, as far as tree ID goes, they're quite a unique tree. They're short-needled conifer. The needles are quite flat. They have a little bit of a stem. They have two lines of stomata on the underside of the needle, and I often just can tell from the habit of the tree that they're very lacy, kind of fine textured foliage. The very terminal top often droops over, and also the bark. If you break off a chunk of bark, the inner bark is a very reddish purplish kind of a color. And often the kind of really best sites are in riparian areas, gullies, moist soil. That can be on the cool side. You'll find them sometimes on more upland sites, rocky, ledgy sites, but because they're so shallow rooted, they often are really prone to damage from drought in those sites. So, I think the really good sites are maybe a little lower and a little more moist and cool.
Excellent. Well, I think we covered it all today, from tree identification to these clearly important pests, insect pests, to climate change. So thank you, Jim and Savannah, for taking the time to join us today to share your work, your passion for these issues, as well as some great tips and thoughts for us as in terms of managing and dealing with these insect pests in Vermont's forests. So thank you to both of you again. Really appreciate you both taking the time to join us and sharing this great information.
Well, thank you. We appreciate you inviting us and for all your technical wizardry to make this happen.
Yes, thank you.
Excellent. Well, again, and thank you to everybody who joined us today and participated in the webinar. Really appreciate everybody's interest in this topic. And just a reminder, I did go ahead and put the link to next week's webinar in the chat box. So hopefully folks can access that. That's the registration link. And with that, if folks are interested in getting the continuing education credits for our presentation today, again, just a reminder that it's has been approved for 1 SAF credit. There will be a webinar survey that'll pop up at the end of the webinar when you sign out. So be on the lookout for that. And then there also, GoToWebinar does send out a secondary email to folks who have registered and attended the event with information on accessing that survey as well. So it's a duplicative kind of thing, but that way, if you have to dash and head out into the woods right after the webinar today or go get your lunch, you have another way to access the survey after the program today. So with that, again, just a huge thank you to our excellent presenters and for everybody for tuning in, and hope everybody has a good rest of the day. Thanks so much, everybody.